The sheriff dragged the outlaw through the dust of Dry Creek with iron chains clattering at his wrists. The whole town stopped to watch. Mothers pulled children close, men leaned against posts, and whispers filled the air like locusts. "Savage," someone muttered. "Horse thief," another spat. "Kill him Friday," a boy shouted, and the crowd laughed nervously. The sheriff tightened his grip, raising his voice. "You'll see justice. By week's end, this man swings." And that was when Ruth Carver stepped out from the edge of the crowd. Her black shawl caught the wind, her face pale against the evening light. A widow, known for her silence, for her loneliness, for never speaking more than a few words at church. Yet now, her voice carried clear. "Don't hurt him. I'll take him home instead." The crowd fell silent. Even the sheriff blinked. For a heartbeat, only the sound of Eli's chains moving against the dirt could be heard. Ruth's words were madness in the eyes of Dry Creek. A woman claiming an outlaw, when the law itself promised a hanging. Why would a widow risk her name, her safety, her soul for a man branded as savage? The sheriff scoffed, but there was unease in his eyes. "You've lost your senses, Ruth. This man ain't fit for your table, let alone your home." But Ruth didn't back away. She had lived 3 years in silence, 3 years in the empty echo of her dead husband's house. The stares of the town had long since condemned her anyway. Something in the outlaw's stillness pulled her forward. And then came the bigger question, the one that sent murmurs racing through the crowd. What did Ruth see in him that no one else did? The outlaw hadn't spoken. Not a word. His gray eyes were fixed on her, steady, as if waiting. As if testing her. The sheriff, impatient, shoved the outlaw forward. "Take him then. His shame will be yours too." Chains rattled, dust rose, and Ruth reached out with trembling hands to take the key. The townsfolk gasped, some laughing, some whispering sharp words, "Crazy widow, lost her mind, cursed for pitying a killer." But Ruth's fingers didn't falter. She turned the key. The chains fell. The outlaw rubbed his wrists, but still said nothing. Only his eyes spoke, a weight Ruth couldn't name, a silence heavier than grief. That night, while the town roared with drunken laughter in the saloon, Ruth lit her single lantern and sat across from the man she had just saved from the noose. The fire cast his face in half-shadow, making him look older, worn, almost broken. Finally, he spoke, his first word since being dragged into town. "Why'd you do it?" Ruth gripped her shawl tighter. The answer came before she could stop it. "Because no one did it for me." And as the wind howled outside her cabin walls, Ruth realized she had done something the whole town would never forgive, something she herself didn't yet understand. The outlaw's gray eyes didn't look away. The silence grew heavier, until it felt like the night itself was holding its breath. And Ruth wondered, what had she really brought home? By morning, the whole town knew. The widow had taken the outlaw into her home. Women carried the news like wildfire through laundry lines and church porches. Men shook their heads outside the saloon, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "She's lost her mind," one said. "She'll end up with a knife in her ribs," another replied. "Or in his bed before the week's out." Laughter followed. Ruth heard it all as she walked to the well. But she kept her chin high. Inside, her hands trembled. At the sheriff's office, Braddock tightened his belt and told anyone who'd listen, "Friday still stands. Widow or not, he'll swing." But when evening came, Ruth found Eli sitting by the fire, the chains gone but his silence heavier than ever. She studied him as he turned a crust of bread in his hand, eating slow, like a man not used to being given food freely. Finally, she asked, "You killed, didn't you?" His gray eyes met hers. No. But I've been close enough for folks to believe it. She wanted to believe him, but how could she? And why, if he claimed innocence, did he let the sheriff drag him like an animal without protest? That was the bigger question, the one that kept her awake as wind rattled the shutters. What was Eli hiding that made him accept the rope without a fight? The next day, neighbors came to Ruth's door. Women offered pity laced with venom. If you need help, we'll take him off your hands. Men warned, if he runs, your blood's on your own floor. But one old man whispered what no one else dared, that outlaw ain't just wanted for stealing. There's talk he carries another man's name. A name the sheriff don't want spoken. Ruth froze. Another name? Another past? That night, she watched Eli in the firelight, his face unreadable, his silence unbroken. And she asked herself, had she brought home a man worth saving, or a man carrying secrets that could burn the whole town down? The third night in Ruth's cabin was colder than the last. She stacked cedar logs onto the fire, the crackle filling the silence. Eli sat close to the flames, his face lit in orange, his gray eyes fixed on nothing. Ruth finally spoke. The sheriff says you've blood on your hands. Tell me plain, did you kill? Eli's jaw tightened. For a long while, he didn't answer. Then, quietly, I took a man's horse. I fired at two who tried to take me in. But I never aimed to kill. Not once. Ruth wanted to believe him. The way his voice cracked on the last word stirred something she hadn't felt since before her husband died. Yet the doubt was heavy. And then Eli said something that froze her. I didn't speak in that jail because the sheriff knows my name. If I'd spoken it, he'd have killed me before Friday ever came. Ruth's breath caught. Then what is your name? He shook his head. Not yet. That answer only deepened the questions. What past was he hiding? Why would the sheriff want him dead without trial? The next day, Ruth went into town for flour. At the general store, two women whispered loud enough for her to hear. They say the outlaw's a deserter. Left men to die in the war. No, he's kin to Braddock. Sheriff wants him gone so no one knows. Ruth clenched her jaw. Lies or truth, it didn't matter. The town would never forgive her for sheltering him. That night, when Eli helped mend her broken fence, she saw the scars across his back as the shirt clung to his skin in the moonlight. They weren't the marks of whips from lawmen. They were old, deliberate, carved deep. Ruth asked, voice low, who did that to you? Eli pulled the shirt closed. Men I once called my own. The bigger question now burned hotter than the fire. What betrayal had scarred this man so deeply that he'd rather face a rope than speak his true name? And as Ruth lay awake listening to his steady breathing near the door, she realized something dangerous. If the sheriff was hiding Eli's past, then protecting him wasn't just defying the town. It might be defying the law itself. Sunday bells echoed through Dry Creek. Ruth walked to church with Eli at her side. No chains. No guards. Just a widow and the man the whole town wanted dead. The whispers started before they reached the door. She's gone mad. She'll bring shame on all of us. Sheriff should have hung him already. Inside, Ruth felt every stare burn against her back. Eli didn't kneel, didn't fold his hands. He stood silent, watching the preacher as if weighing every word. After service, Sheriff Braddock stepped forward, his hand heavy on his revolver. This ends Friday. You've played wife to a killer long enough. Ruth steadied her breath. You fear him because of his name. Tell it, if you dare. The sheriff's eyes darkened. His name's a stain on this town. His blood runs with mine. My brother shamed us all when he deserted in war. And now he hides behind silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eyes swung back to Eli. Ruth turned sharply. Is it true? Eli's lips parted, but for a moment, no sound came. Finally, he said low, I left the war. Yes. But not for cowardice. For what I saw. The sheriff spat. Lies. He left men to die while he crawled away. And I'll see the rope prove it. The bigger question now thundered in Ruth's mind. What truth could be so terrible that the sheriff would rather brand his own brother a coward than let it be spoken aloud? That night, back at the cabin, Eli finally spoke. His voice cracked as he stared into the fire. I deserted because the men under Braddock weren't killed by the enemy. They were slaughtered on his orders. To cover his theft of supplies. Ruth's heart pounded. If Eli was right, then the sheriff wasn't hunting justice. He was hunting silence. She clutched the shawl at her shoulders, realizing the danger had doubled. If Braddock feared Eli's voice more than his gun, then Friday's hanging wasn't punishment. It was erasure. The fire crackled, the night pressed close, and Ruth knew one thing with terrifying certainty. If she wanted to save Eli, she'd have to face the sheriff before the gallows did. Friday dawn came red over Dry Creek. The gallows stood ready. The sheriff's men gathered, rifles gleaming in the light. The crowd pressed close, eager for blood. Ruth stood at the edge, shawl pulled tight, Eli beside her in silence. Chains had been returned to his wrists. His gray eyes were calm, almost resigned. The sheriff raised his voice. This outlaw is no man. He's a deserter. A coward. A shame to my name and this town. By the rope, we cleanse ourselves of him. The crowd muttered agreement, but unease rippled too. Some remembered the fire at the mill, the children Eli had carried out, the barns he'd saved. And then, as the sheriff placed the noose over Eli's head, a voice rang out, Ruth's. You call him coward, but I call him brother to your guilt. Gasps tore through the crowd. Ruth's hand trembled as she lifted a ledger she had carried from the cabin, a weathered book Eli had hidden beneath the floorboards. The supplies. The stolen goods. Proof Braddock sold them for coin while his men starved. Proof he ordered the slaughter. The sheriff's face turned pale. Lies, he barked, but sweat rolled down his temple. A murmur rose. Neighbors looked from Ruth to the sheriff, to Eli. Doubt spread like fire in dry grass. Eli's voice broke the silence. I carried that guilt so no one else would die for it. I stayed silent to protect the truth. But I'll die speaking it now. The bigger question now shook everyone's heart. Would the town believe the widow and the outlaw, or the lawman who ruled them with fear? Suddenly, smoke rose from the edge of town. A barn fire, fierce and fast. Shouts broke out, panic scattering the crowd. Without hesitation, Eli pulled free, sprinting toward the flames. He kicked open doors, hauled a boy out by his collar, then a mother fainting in the smoke. By the time the fire died, Eli's shirt was black, his hands blistered. The noose lay forgotten. The crowd stood in silence. Finally, the preacher stepped forward. If this is cowardice, may we all be cowards. One by one, neighbors lowered their heads. No cheers, no claps, just quiet acknowledgement. A shift. The sheriff's hand hovered at his gun but dropped. He knew the fight was lost. That night, in Ruth's cabin, Eli carved a ring from cedar and placed it in her hand. His voice was raw. I've no gold, no preacher's blessing. But I've got choice. If you'll have it. Ruth closed her fingers over the ring. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. Yet as she looked out the window toward the darkened town, one thought lingered. The sheriff had been beaten, but not broken. And secrets buried in war had a way of clawing back into the light.